Hello, in this group of videos, we're going to explore more about our aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. Essentially, this will be Miller's Chapter 11. I actually kind of viewed Miller's Chapters 10 and 11 as aggregate supply and demand 1 and aggregate supply and aggregate demand 2. So that's how I'm kind of approaching it, but I'm trying to cater to the textbook as much as possible. So in the first discussion of aggregate supply and aggregate demand, we really focused on the long-run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand. And so I'm going to pick up there. When we're talking about this model, we're always talking about these being the labels to our axes. That's the output of the economy, the real output of the economy, and that's the price level. Our long-run aggregate supply curve is vertical. And the reason it's vertical is because this is commensurate to having a production possibilities curve between two goods, which would somehow, or services, which would somehow encapsulate all of the economy. So we could say, how about I call these goods most goods and services, and then I call this the rest of goods and services. If it's not most of it, then it's in the rest of it. So that's pretty much everything, right? And what we're saying here is that this is producing at a point where we, in this bundle of these two things, which is everything, where we're making full use of our resources. And how we define full use of our resources might include our natural rate of unemployment being present, but no cyclical unemployment being present. And so if this bundle of goods where we might be targeting here would be representative of all the output of the economy captured here. And it's all what we can do because the output that we can produce is a function of our labor force, our property, plant, and equipment, which we call capital, our natural resources, and the skill level of that labor force, and the know-how that we have of how to do stuff, which we call technology, which improves all of those things. So these things are related. This is all a review of what we discussed in Chapter 10. Now, we also have a willingness and ability to buy various amounts of output at various price levels. And what I just described there is aggregate demand, and our aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, and we explored why that is likely so. Now, this level of output is what we can produce in the economy, which gets us to this term Say's law. Say's law, I believe I discussed in the last video, but it's in Chapter 11 with Miller. Say's law says that supply creates its own demand. So what we can make is how much we'll actually buy. So if we have increases in aggregate demand, then what that would lead to would just be inflation, people bidding up prices of what we can make. So let me go ahead and draw in an increase in aggregate demand, and this is called the classical view because this was what was expected to changes with these kinds of changes in the economy prior to the 1930s. Now, the 1930s, aggregate demand was not high. Aggregate demand was actually quite low. The 1930s was the Great Depression. But you know what? I'm trying to turn a new leaf here and give us more of a positive, happy, cheery first go around with applying our aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework in a more sort of realistic way in the short term. I'm trying to be positive about things. So I have aggregate demand increasing. Don't worry if you're feeling very disappointed. Don't worry. In another video I'll record after this, I'll have aggregate demand fall. I'll get into some negative stuff. We'll get there, but let's start with things being good. Okay, let's do that. So what the classical view would predict then would be demand pull inflation like this. Because price level is what classical economists, really all economists, call a nominal variable. It's sort of fluffy. It's not real. Real variables are called real variables. So the output that we can make is a real variable. That's goods and services, tangible things we can touch or do. It's commensurate with real employment. When the alarm clock goes off in the morning to go to work, the bed is nice and warm and toasty. This time of year, in the fall or spring, especially, it's nice and toasty. But out there, not so toasty. Feel that cold air on your face, and you think, I want to stay in bed. You have to take down the blankets and put your feet on that cold floor to go to work. That is very real. That is a sensation that is definitely for real. It is not nominal. If our prices and our wages were to double, going to work would still be very real. But that change in the price level and our wages wouldn't be very real. It would be nominal, at least in the longer term. It would affect our savings, but I think you're getting the idea. This is a nominal variable. This is a real variable. The classical economists would suggest that what would happen here, if anybody thought that this price change was affecting them, would be what's called money illusion. That's being deceived into thinking that your wage increase is a real raise, and you just haven't yet realized that your wage increase is just part of all of price level increase. So, this was the point of view on the positive side, going into the 1930s. But then in the 1930s, not in this manner that we're doing here, but I'm going to get back to that, we discovered that prices didn't move as liquidly as is depicted here. Prices moved slowly, and output did not stay right as predicted here. Output actually varies with price level. So the classical dichotomy is illustrated here, where nominal variables and real variables are not related to each other. The nominal variable can change, but the real variable stays the same. That's the dichotomy, or the separation of the two, nominal variables and real variables. But if we throw another line on here, this, prior to having this other line existing, this would have just been, there was no reason to draw it at all, but this would have been aggregate supply, and that's it, and that's all. But I have an LRAS in there for long run aggregate supply, and now I'm going to draw in its alternative, which is an SRAS for short run aggregate supply. And I realize some textbooks only call this AS and this LRAS, but it doesn't cost a whole lot for me to put an additional 2 letters on this name. So I'm always going to call this short run aggregate supply and long run aggregate supply. Now, with this thrown into our model, we can make sort of more robust predictions. Now, with this on here and these distinctions in our labels, what we can see is that when aggregate demand is high, and perhaps this is happening because people are just optimistic about the future. Something has happened in the world and people feel better about things. Like, I don't know, the announcement that a vaccine has been developed and will be able to be in mass production within a couple of weeks. Perhaps that could do something like change people's expectations of the future and increase aggregate demand. I don't know. We'll find out. So, if that happens, what that might do, if we were at, I'm sorry, that might not be the best example, because if we were at our natural rate of output, which in the example I gave, we're probably not, but if we could be down here, but if we were, that's what would happen. This is what would happen. Now we would be moving to a different point than we were in our first model before we included SRAS. In our first model before we included SRAS, that's what was depicted here. But now, something different is going to happen. Now, in the short run, we have movement along a curve that I've added to the model, and output actually changes. we actually go up in output. Now, if we were over here, how could that be so if we were at our production possibilities and we don't have any change in resources? Well, right here, laborers, it's not written in stone that we have to work the same amount of hours as we do at our typical level of output. We can work more hours. But what I've been doing is polling students about that in discussion and finding that most people do, as our model kind of suggests here, and we work more hours when given the chance to, say, get overtime for a while, but not indefinitely. So the indefinite level of output is according to our resources, what we could do in perpetuity or forever. If there was no growth, this is how much we would work, and this is how much output we would have. Of course, we have growth, but that doesn't mean we necessarily have to work more to have growth. We can have growth in other things. But at our natural rate of output, we could exceed that for a while. So we're talking about a situation like this in green, where we can produce more output for a while, and that will push up on prices, but not completely a price change with no output change. See, now we only push up on prices this much in the short term. And why would that be so? Well, people are bidding stuff up because they want it. Prices are being bid up, not as much as predicted by the classical view where it's entirely a price change. Oh, people want more stuff, they just bid up the prices, but the amount of stuff we make is still the same. No, here we're bidding up stuff, but we're also making more stuff, so the price, in the short run, so the price rise happens, but not as great as it otherwise would have if we weren't able to make a little bit more stuff. How are we making a little bit more stuff? We're working overtime. The U.S. standard work week is cited as 40 hours a week because for many states, including the state of Maryland, for most employers, if you employ somebody greater than 40 hours per week, you're required to pay them additional pay, marginally, like time and a half. Not all employers are required to do that. Some are exempt in the state of Maryland, and different states have different rules. But 40 hours a week, as a rule of thumb, is the U.S. standard work week. Now, statistically, you can find some sources that will say the typical American works 44 hours a week because some Americans may work part-time jobs. And on average, that may fall out to 44. Now, other sources will say the typical American works 34 or so hours a week, I've seen. So you can choose your source all you want. Say, no, 40 is not right. 34 is not right. That doesn't matter. Whatever is typical can be exceeded for a while. Because if you're a part-time worker, you can work more than you typically do for a while, but there's a reason you're working part-time, isn't there? Maybe school. How long are you going to neglect school just because aggregate demand is up? Probably for a while before you're going to start to say, I don't want to work this much, and do something about it. Now notice what's happening here. People are working more, they're producing this greater amount of aggregate supply in the short run. The quantity supplied is up along the short run aggregate supply curve. But they're getting paid time and a half. What does that mean about the money in their pockets? More buying power, right? So they're pushing up prices further in this bidding war, and because firms are paying them time and a half, that's a rise in the firm's input prices. As a worker is getting burned out on working overtime, and firms are having to pay overtime, and workers being burned out are starting to say things like, look, I want a raise, and I don't want to continue to work this hard, because over here they're hiring people because they're trying to meet this higher aggregate demand, and they're raising wages over there. We begin to have prices and wages really starting to move, and we still get back to where the classical economists had predicted. It's just called a long-run aggregate supply curve because it doesn't happen immediately. We then move back along our aggregate demand curve. As these prices rise, the quantity demanded along the new aggregate demand curve begins to fall, and we move it in a slower manner than predicted by the classical economists. We move from point A to point B to point C over time. long run rather than immediate. And those are the reasons why. And what that does then is gets us back down to where we would have been before the jump in aggregate demand. So that's the positive view of the distinction between classical economists and what came after the 1930s, which is called Keynesian Economics, because of John Maynard Keynes' book, The General Theory, written in 1936, which began to model and discuss these kinds of things and these kinds of changes. And we can still call this demand pull inflation. What we see here is due to the rise in demand. It's just not as marked of a jump in inflation as it maybe would have been predicted prior to the 1930s. So I think I've gone through this positive. I call it positive because having more goods and services and having the opportunity to make overtime, get paid more, I don't know, it feels nice to me. I think I've really beat to death this positive scenario using our model to hopefully bring home the ideas in chapters 10 and 11. So I think I'm going to stop recording this video, and now for those who have been really excited and waiting, we'll start to get into some more of our traditional doom and gloom kind of scenarios.